Hello everybody, Kemo Sabi here, coming at you with another video. Shirtless tonight, it's a hot one. We live in a loft, so I'm just going with no shirt tonight. Hopefully it doesn't bother you. If it does, then maybe I'll pass this one. Thanks. So this is a write-up off of nymag webpage. I read it by David Wallace-Wells, published October 10, 2018, with the topic of UN says climate genocide is coming. It's actually worse than that. Just 2 years ago, amid global fanfare, the Paris Climate Accords were signed, initiating what seemed for a brief moment like the beginning of a planet-saving moment. But almost immediately, the international goal to establish limiting global warming to 2 degrees Celsius began to seem, to too many of the world's most vulnerable, dramatically inadequate. The Marshall Islands representative gave it a blunter name, calling 2 degrees of warming genocide. The alarming new report you may have read about this week from the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which examines just how much better 1.5 degrees of warming would be than 2, echoes the charge. Amplified may be the better term. Hundreds of millions of lives are at stake, the report declares. Should the world warm more than 1.5 degrees Celsius, which it will do as soon as 2040, which is 12 years, everybody. Not a lot. Definitely still my time. If the current trends continue, nearly all coral reefs would, more like will, die out. Wildfires and heat waves would sweep across the planet annually, that means every year. And the interplay between drought and flooding and temperature would mean that the world's food supply would become dramatically less secure. Avoiding that scale of suffering, the report says, requires such a thorough transformation of the world's economy, agriculture, and culture that there is no documented historical precedent. The New York Times declared that the report showed a strong risk of climate crisis in the coming decades. In Grist, Eric Holthus wrote that civilization is at stake. If you're alarmed by those sentences, you should be. They are horrifying. But it is actually worse than that, considerably worse. That is because the new report's worst-case scenario is actually a best case. In fact, it is a beyond best-case scenario. What has been called a genocidal level of warming is already our inevitable future. The question is, how much worse than that will it get? Bearing the arrival of dramatic new carbon-sucking technologies, which are so far from scalability at present that they are best described as fantasies as industrial absolution, it will not be possible to keep warming below 2 degrees Celsius. The level the new report describes as a climate catastrophe, as a planet, we are coursing along a trajectory that brings us north of 4 degrees by the end of the century. The IPCC is right that 2 degrees marks a world of climate catastrophe. 4 degrees is twice as bad as that. And that is where we are headed at present, a climate hell twice as hellish as the one the IPCC says. Rightly, we must avoid, at all costs, but the real meaning of the report is not climate change is much worse than you think, because anyone who knows the state of the research will find nothing surprising in it. The real meaning is you now have permission to freak out. As recently as a year ago, when I published a magazine cover story exploring worst-case scenarios for climate change, alarmism of this kind was considered amenthia to many scientists, who believed that storytelling that focused on the scary possibilities was just damaging to the public engagement as denial. There have been a few scary developments in climate research over the past year. More methane from Arctic lakes and permafrost than expected would accelerate warming and unprecedented heat wave, Arctic wildfires, and hurricanes rolling through both of the world's major oceans this past summer. But by and large, the consensus is the same. We are on track for 4 degrees of warming, more than twice as much as most scientists believe is possible to endure without inflicting climate suffering on hundreds of millions or threatening at least parts of the social and political infrastructure we call grand civilization. The only thing that changed this week is that the scientists finally have hit the panic button. Because the numbers are so small, we tend to trivialize the differences between 1 degree and 2 degrees and 4. Human experience and memory offers no good analogy for how we should think about those thresholds. But with the degrees of warming, as with world wars or recurrences of cancer, you don't want to see even 1. At 2 degrees, the melting of ice sheets will pass a tipping point of collapse, flooding dozens of the world's major cities this century. At this amount of warming, it is estimated global GDP per capita will be cut by 13%. 400 million more people will suffer from water scarcity, and even in the northern latitudes, heat waves will kill thousands each summer. It will be worse in the planet's equatorial band. In India, where many cities now numbering in the many millions will become unlivably hot. There would be 32 times as many extreme heat waves, each lasting 5 times as long and exposing, in total, 93 times more people. This is 2 degrees, and particularly speaking, our absolute best-case climate scenario. At 3 degrees, southern Europe will be in permanent drought. The average drought in Central America would last 19 months, and in the Caribbean 21 months. In northern Africa, the figure is 60 months, 5 years. The areas burned each year by wildfires would double in the Mediterranean and sextuple in the United States, beyond the sea level rise, which will already be swallowing cities from Miami Beach to Jakarta. Damages just from river flooding will grow 30-fold in Bangladesh, 20-fold in India, and as much as 60-fold in the UK. This is 3 degrees better than we do if all the nations of the world honored their Paris commitments, which none of them are, particularly speaking, bearing those dramatic tech deus ex machinas. This seems to me about as positive a realistic outcome as it is rational to expect. At 4 degrees, there would be 8 million cases of dengue fever each year in Latin America alone. Global grain yields could fall by as much as 50%, producing annual or close to annual food crisis. The global economy would be more than 30% smaller than it would be without climate change, and we would see at least half again as much conflict and warfare as we do today, possibly more. Our current trajectory, remember, takes us higher still. And while there are many reasons to think we will bend that curve soon, the plummeting cost of renewable energy, the growing global consensus about phasing out coal, it is worth remembering that whatever you may have heard about the green revolution and the price of solar, at present global carbon emissions are still growing. None of the above is news. Most of that data is drawn from that single conventional wisdom fact sheet. In fact, nothing in the IPCC report is news either, not to the scientific community or to the climate activists, or even to anyone who has been a close reader of new research about warming over the last few years. One moment. That is what the IPCC does. It does not introduce new findings or even new perspectives, but rather corrals the messy mass of existing pedigreed scientific research into consensus assessment designed to deliver to the policymaker of the world an absolutely unquestionable account of the state of knowledge. Almost since the panel was convened in 1988, it has been criticized for being too cautious in its assessment of the problem. A large body of temperamentally cautious scientists, zeroing in on those predictions they can all agree on and which they may have hoped policymakers might find workable. The panel's Wikipedia page has separate subsections for the outdatedness of reports and conservative nature of the IPCC reports, which is why it is remarkable that the tone of this report is so alarmist. It's not that the news about the climate has changed, but it's that the scientific community is finally discarding caution in describing the implications of its own finding. They have also thankfully offered a practical suggestion, proposing the imposition of a carbon tax many, many times higher than is currently in use or being considered. They propose raising the cost of a ton of carbon possibly as high as $5,000 by 2030, a price they suggest may have to grow to $27,000 per ton by 2100. Today, the average price of carbon across 42 major economies is just $8 per ton. The new Nobel Nobel Literate in Economics, William Nordhaus, made his name by almost inventing the economic study of climate change, and his preferred carbon tax is $40 per ton, which would probably land us the about 3.5 degrees of warming. He considers that a grotesque level optimal. But a carbon tax is only a spark to action, not action itself, and the action needed is at a scale and a speed almost unimaginably to most of us. The IPCC report called is unprecedented. Other activists often see one precedent in all of human history, citing the model of how the United States prepared for World War II and calling for global mobilization of that kind. All of the world's rivalrous societies and nationalistic governments and self-interested industries organize around the common pursuit of a stable, uncomfortable climate, as though warming was an existential threat. It is, and the World War II mobilization metaphor is not hyperbole. To avoid warming of the kind the IPCC now calls catastrophic requires a complete rebuilding of the entire energy infrastructure of the world, a thorough reworking of the agricultural practices and diet to entirely eliminate carbon emissions from farming, and a battery of culture changes to the way those of us in the wealthy West at least conduct our lives, and we all need to do all of that in 2, or possibly 3 decades. As a comparison, simply the last phase of the recent 3-stop extension of New York City's 2nd Avenue subway line took 12 years. All told, from the first groundbreaking, the project took 45 years. That is not to say it's over or we're doomed. Stalling warming before or below 4 degrees is better than surpassing it. Keeping the temperatures below 3 is better still, and the closer we get to 2 degrees, the more miraculous. That is better, because climate change isn't binary and doesn't just kick in full force any particular temperature level. It's a function that gets worse over time as long as we produce greenhouse gases. How long can we continue to this is really up to us, which is to say it will be determined in the province of politics, which is to say public panic like that produced by the IPCC report can be very productive form of policy pressure. There are also those far-fetched alternatives I mentioned, carbon capture and solar geoengineering, but each is far from workable at the moment, and even in theory come with really scary drawbacks. But even if the technology becomes dramatically cheaper and more efficient over the next few years, you would need to build them out across the globe as well. Whole plantations sucking carbon almost everywhere on the planet. It will take quite a lot of time to build those. In other words, even if they worked, and we simply don't have that many years left to act. A few weeks ago, as the IPCC reported loomed, I had lunch with a prominent climate scientist who had been involved in earlier reports and had done considerable work on local preparedness as well. I asked if he thought New York would eventually build a sea wall or surge barrier to protect the city from sea level rise and flooding. Yes, he said, Manhattan will be protected at any cost, but major infrastructure projects like these takes decades, typically about 30 years. Even if we begin building today, he said, the barrier would not be finished in time to save Howard Beach and other parts of the southern Queens and Brooklyn. Sure enough, he said, you'll see the city adjust accordingly, halting new infrastructure projects there, eventually pulling back from even, quote, sanitation maintenance like sewer repairs, and generally signaling to current residents that they will not be able to leave behind their homes when they die to their children. And of course, a seawall to protect New York only encloses the narrows of New York Harbor, leaving all of Long Island exposed. This is just the threat from sea level in just one very rich metropolitan area. The world is much bigger than that, but so is climate change. It is also very fast. With more than half the carbon humanity has ever emitted into the atmosphere, with more than half, with more than half of the carbon humanity has ever emitted into the atmosphere, having come in just in the last 25 years since Al Gore published his first book on climate change, Monday's IPCC. Many seem like a dramatic departure, and it is. But there is going to be much more like it coming. So as long as we continue to squander what little time we have, the news will only get worse from here. There you have it, everybody. Not necessarily a bright, rosy topic, but hopefully you enjoyed it. If you leave me some comments, that'd be great. And it'd be awesome if you subscribed. Kemo Sabi out, and we'll see you in the next one. Thanks. Bye.